Well, Hosni Mubarak is no longer the president of Egypt, but the protesters aren't finished. They have vowed to keep up the pressure on the military to remind them who's in charge of Egypt's revolution. The shockwaves in Egypt can also be felt throughout the rest of the Middle East, with protests in Algeria, Yemen, Jordan, Bahrain, and even Iran. Shadi Hamid is the director of research at Brookings Doha Center, and he joins me now over the telephone from Jordan. Mr. Hamid, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Is this revolution spreading?
It seems like it is. We're seeing protests all throughout the region. People are drawing inspiration from the Egyptian model. And I think what people are saying is if it happened first in Tunisia, and now that it's happened in Egypt, why can't it happen elsewhere? There was always a sense that Tunisia was somehow exceptional, a little bit remote from the rest of the region, but Egypt is really in many ways the heart and soul of the Arab world. So people look up to Egypt, and I think Egyptians have really provided an impressive model for other opposition groups throughout the region.
Well, you know, there was a very interesting story this morning in the New York Times about the coordination between the young activists in Tunisia with those in Egypt and linking the two events, actually. So social networking obviously played a huge part in this, right?
Sure. I mean, these protesters throughout the region are linked together through Twitter and Facebook. I was actually just talking to a youth leader in Tahrir Square when I was in Cairo the other day, and he was telling me just the day after that he's already talking to opposition activists in other countries trying to transmit their model elsewhere and sharing ideas about how other groups can proceed. So there's already this sense that Arabs are all part of a community, that this is really becoming a pan-Arab democratic moment. And I don't think that kind of transmission of knowledge would have been possible without social media and new ways of communicating.
Right, but it's making some other rulers in the Middle East very nervous, yes? I mean, we know, for example, that King Abdullah contacted President Obama earlier on before Mubarak stepped down, asking him to support Mubarak, because there are a lot of rulers in the Middle East who don't want to see this kind of change from the bottom up.
Sure, if I was a regime official in an Arab country, I'd be pacing in my palace right now because this is not a good time for them. I was actually just meeting with government officials here in Jordan earlier today, and they're certainly nervous, and they're trying to preempt change by at least initiating some reform. So different countries are approaching this in different ways. Some are trying to essentially bribe their citizens, as we've seen in Kuwait, where they're providing a yearly stipend, or here in Jordan, where they actually seem somewhat serious about some reforms. In any case, the point here is that everyone is trying to find a way to respond. And none of these regimes are guaranteed to be stable anymore. There was always a sense that some of these autocratic regimes could just last indefinitely. But now we're seeing the end of this so-called stability paradigm. The Arab world is no longer stable.
So that has big repercussions for Washington and Europe, doesn't it?
Sure, because as we know, the U.S. has supported many of these autocratic regimes with billions of dollars of assistance over decades. And in many ways, the U.S. foreign policy in the region has been oriented not around Arab publics, but around these regimes. So that whole premise seems to be falling apart. And after seeming to be behind the curve on Egypt, the Obama administration seems to be evolving on this, and they're coming to terms that we're talking about a totally different reality here. And I think it's really important for the U.S. to be on the right side of history on this. And time will tell if we can adapt our policy accordingly. But it's very clear that protesters are not going to back down anytime soon. So the question is, does the U.S. want to be part of that change and facilitate these democratic transitions, or does it want to try to stay behind some of these old autocratic rulers and see if there's a way for them to survive? And that's going to be a very relevant question. In Yemen, in Jordan, in Bahrain, these are all U.S.-supported governments.
Right, and one of the things we learned, though, from the protesters in Egypt is that one of their biggest gripes is the lack of jobs, the lack of economic opportunity. They go to university, they get out, they've got nothing to do. And democratic governments aren't going to be able to change that overnight.
Yeah, that's the real concern right now. Revolutions always start off with very high expectations, and sometimes people expect changes very quickly, but that's not the way it works out. So there's the real risk of having dashed expectations and for people to become disillusioned with the revolution. So I think in that respect, the coming phase for a country like Egypt will be just as important as the previous phase. Democratic transitions are slow and difficult and sometimes messy, and Egyptians will have to be vigilant to make sure the promises of the military, which is now in power, are fulfilled.
Well, as for the other countries that you mentioned in the region, is it likely, do you think, that you will see substantial change?
Well, I think what we learned from Tunisia and then Egypt was that you can't predict revolutions before they happen. So I'm very hesitant to make predictions. We didn't see Tunisia coming, and after Tunisia, we didn't see Egypt coming either. So, but that said, all bets are off. As I said, no regime is guaranteed anymore, and we're seeing protests emerge everywhere. Yemen could be next. Jordan could be next. It's really hard to tell.